We're seeing organizations invest heavily in AI platforms and automation. And yet, many leaders are quietly struggling with adoption, with trust, fatigue, and resistance. And I've been thinking a lot about this idea that high tech transformation is accelerating at unprecedented rate, but the high touch change is lagging behind. And today's conversation is about that tension. What actually makes change stick when technology moves faster than people are ready for? Now, I'm really excited to explore this conversation with my guest today. Kimberly Shaw's work sits right at that intersection where strategy, design, and human reality collide. Kimberly, welcome to Tides. I am so excited and I'm really looking forward to exploring this topic with you.
Thrilled to be here. I'm excited as well. I think this is prime time for us to be having these kinds of conversations.
Absolutely. And you're no stranger to digital transformation. In fact, I read a stat somewhere which said that 70% of digital transformations and efforts don't yield the results and the impacts that organizations look for. So, since you've played in this space for such a long time, from your perspective, where do transformation efforts most often fail in practice? What doesn't go right?
That is a loaded question. And even the stat that you're referring to, which is well played and well worn, in our practice and in the market, is a bit tricky as well. And I think what it really points to is the suggestion that if transformations are not carefully designed and structured, and value is not considered in terms of the outcomes, then its risk of failure is extremely high. So I'm coming at it, at least in this discussion, from the corner of success management and
Yeah.
looking at the transformational approaches that support success, or I'll dare say successes, because I think, transformation tends to be a long game. It tends to be complex. It tends to be many things, and often across many initiatives that comprise a whole set of outcomes. So with AI, which is part of the reason why we're here today, I think it just adds another layer of complexity to the overall transformational management challenges that we have in our roles.
Yeah, I hear you completely. Transformation is definitely playing the long game. But at the same time, I've heard number of times that leaders underestimate when they make statements like the tech is ready. Why isn't the transformation happening?
Absolutely. I think implementation thinking is part of the problem that we have. And in the work that we're doing in practice around AI, particularly AI enablement, it is encouraging leadership to take that step back in the decision-making process where we seem to be very focused on an implementation approach to what is considered a tool, a technology, an enhancement, an augmentation, and really treat it as the set of intelligences that it offers the organization. And frankly, at the level of leadership, where we do have those strategic drivers, where we do have those accountabilities around realizing them, and where we have also a really good opportunity to knit into governance.
I feel like sometimes when we look at transformation or change, the change could not be transformative change. It could be simple, easy change in an organization. Resistance pops up. And the moment we hear the word resistance, it's attached to people. How much do you think is resistance a people challenge versus the design challenge or a combination of both?
I think it's a combination of both. And I think it begins with this notion of how we approach, define, and consider resistance. So out of the gate, I think what's implied when we suggest resistance is that it is somehow a bit more negative, that it is somehow dangerous to a set of outcomes or to a delivery. And I think beginning there, it really needs to be embraced as an opportunity to lean into the fact that we have some honesty, some truths that are available to us to be able to determine the successes that are needed to reach our outcomes, to set the deliverable. I think in addition to that, it also invites us to consider how we might structure and design a transformation program with people at the center in terms of embracing that resistance, what's informing that resistance, adding some truth and some perspective to how we might design to be able to support, to debunk, if you will, to demythologize, but to also actively solicit and make safe those perspectives that are seen, I think, often as counter or contradictory or challenging, as I mentioned earlier, to that which we are doing. I think it's exactly the opposite. It could actually result, with arms around it, to better results than we even imagined at outset.
And for people who are new to this conversation about design and friction and resistance and the people centric approach, how would you explain to them what is design in this mix? Because traditionally, and I'll give you my lived experience. Back in the day, all organizations were thinking about implementing ERP. And by the time it got to the change team, the decisions, the choices, everything was already taken care of. The system was configured. And then the change team was brought in to say, can you help with the adoption of this new process, new behavior, new ways of working? What do you mean when we talk about design in this context?
And I think you're really pointing at it. It's this need to really early and often engage, and I'm going to say change management and transformation management from the outset. So it should be ideally, and those are just the most blissful moments in transformation work that we've done, where we are complicit and collaborative and co-created in the decisions, where there is a level of advisory from the beginning, from a people perspective especially, to be able to inform the decisions that are driving that solution perspective in the environment. With that, I think there's also the opportunity to bring in those end users, those key users, those SMEs and process owners into the mix early. And we often do it through change organization. So we know that people have roles, they have things to do in the organization. We have names for it. But this is looking at it as a bit of a side by side organization in support of the deliverable and really looking at ways to build network, to build and expand on agency. We've probably, many of us, heard about change agency and how we want to encourage that. But this is really, and I think this relates also to not just transformation as a whole, but also the AI focus that we have as part of transformative, decisions and outcomes in organizations, is this idea that they're complicit and they're actually co-owners of not just the decisions, but also the work, the shared successes. And ideally, if we're doing it well, which I think takes design a little bit forward in our conversation, moves beyond the delivery and into the organization as part of transition and sustainment.
So, would it be fair to say then that the old playbook of change, not that we've designed the playbook in an ideal fashion, but whatever was like we designed the playbook depending on what the organization was ready to buy from the change practitioner's perspective. Do you think that playbook still works in today's context? Because change has always been there. We are not new to change, but with AI in the mix, I think the speed, the scale, the scope of change is truly unprecedented. Are we as humans wired to adapt to this speed of change? And two, if this change is not going to stop, if this change is coming towards us, can we still apply the same old playbook to this current situation of change that we are dealing with? And if not, how do we modify that? Where do we go from there? Where do we evolve from there?
Yeah, and that is the $1 million conversation I think many of us are having right now. And I'll come at it as a bit of a challenger to this notion of I'm even resistant to the word playbook these days.
Mhm.
Given how I think it's changed from what it was intended, which is not actually a bad thing, right? It was guidance, framework, structure, right? An attempt. The challenge that we have is that all the things that you mentioned, size, scale, scope, magnitude, speed, if we want
Yeah.
to add that to the list of, change identification. I think that is on steroids now. It is absolutely heightened relative to what is demanded internally and externally of our organizations. Just take a look around us. Plenty is happening. And where I'm going with that is that I think it absolutely presses upon us as a practice to respond, to be responsive in the manner in which we are using those good fundamentals, those great frameworks, those supportive structures, but to be responsive to the factors and the triggers and the drivers that we are confronting, that is coming across as not just a single set of work, which I think a lot of us are accustomed to. And I'm going to
Mhm.
speak more from a consultant perspective, where we are brought in as hired hands. We come in, we do a job. We're typically aligned to a single act or a single event. It isn't like that anymore. More and more, we're confronted with understanding holistically how a change is applying to a multitude of changes and a multitude of drivers and a multitude of factors that are informing not just the decisions and the transformations, and I'll say plurally themselves, but
Mhm.
also the constantly evolving and developing and ideally progressive set of outcomes that we're achieving. It's not a single event anymore. And I think that's part of the biggest challenge is it's not a static activity. I think there's something else that you pointed to relative to speed. And I think that plays into our technological landscape, especially as informed by AI. And that is that we necessarily have been, especially I mentioned implementation earlier, have always been in that prescriptive mode of our dependency, right? So whether it's, vendor dependency or whether it's, a certain select expertise, generally groups and individuals that tend to know more about a subject area than we do. And I'm not saying that's any different for what's happening within AI. In fact, I think it's probably multitude and magnitude. But I think more and more we're seeing a heightened need for accountability and responsibility for organizations at the level of organization to begin with, to be able to guide and inform those decisions that implore and invite and implement these kinds of tools, technologies, intelligences, opportunities in an environment for purposes of benefit. I think it's a bit of string theory, if you will, where was maybe more linear in perspective, and I think playbooks tend to lean that way.
Mhm.
We are looking at, a ball of yarn that we are constantly and consistently trying to make sense of respective to a collective group of needs, organizational team, individual. We're also more accepting, I think, increasingly of that ball of yarn and realizing that it's probably going to be more tangled at certain points than less, that it's not going to be linear, that it's not singular, and that's the challenge to how we practice in those environments with people.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful point that you make because this is one big difference for us to think about change in today's times versus in the past, that the end state of this change is not defined yet. It's not like we have a piece of land, here's a prefab home, come and just put it on the piece of land. We have a piece of land, but we don't know what type of house or building we are building. So it's like that analogy, building the plane while we are flying it. We don't even know sometimes that we are building a plane.
Yes, and that's one of my favorites from you actually is, all of our norms and forms are actually up for challenge. We've
Mhm.
been so destination focused that we haven't even considered the vehicles, in which we're traveling. But I think that's where the opportunity is, and the creativity potentially. Speaking personally, even though we are probably more than ever more knowledge based, more data driven, right? That is our current and that's our future. But I think there's also an opening here for us to be really creative about our approaches to being able to apply that knowledge, that information in ways that are very much in true value realization,
Mhm.
relative to what we're trying to achieve. And I think that piece, I would like to see it more embraced, to be honest,
Yeah.
where we truly are in the midst of that art and science, discussion for me anyway, at this point or this juncture in my career, is meaningful.
Yeah, yeah. And this brings us back to this point that we were talking about earlier, that change, like the tactical part of change, which we have been so conditioned to think about once decisions and choices have been made. Now, let's focus on communication and training, which is such a small part of supporting strategic change in an organization. I think now, with the power of technology that is at our disposal, we can actually leverage some of the data, the insights from listening activities from our employees in the organization to understand what is the change capacity of our organization, where will change land effectively versus not. And this is the moment for change practitioners to kind of leverage that's at our disposal at this time and age and inform decision making at the word that I'm looking for is at the get go, at the inception of change versus once the decisions and choices have been made. We can help support
Yeah.
and form better choices and decisions.
Yes, I love that, and there are a few things that, when you're speaking, what really resonates with me is the empowerment of our own practice to empower our organizations, right? Our teams and other individuals, and I do believe, just as you're saying that there is a rich opportunity here, to leverage, really what I consider to be sort of, technical evolution, right? And I'm speaking of it intelligently to inform ourselves to better inform others. There is that sense. I think there's also a mention you make there that I really love about, in some ways, hardening our practice. And, we've had much debate about, change being considered soft in some respects
Mhm.
because of its people centricity. And I think we all agree that that's an underestimation and a half. And there's nothing soft in it at all.
Yeah.
But I love your mention of the benefit and the opportunity around data driven decisions, around data driven supports, which reinforce that which we are discovering and seeing. And I'm going to add in a piece in here that we're discovering recently is that sometimes the data
Mhm.
does not determine what we thought we were seeing or what we expected to see. So the ability for us to use data in more real time, in fresher states, and there's a lot of dependency on good data in that too, and that's
Mhm.
a whole other conversation. But the ability for us to reinforce rapid and agile and assertive decision making in critical moments that actually drive success and are supportive of the organization and where it's going, I think it's better than ever.
Yeah.
So it should be less intimidating to us in that way and more of a gift in some respects if we're harnessing it correctly for what we do.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there are like data is just one of the many elements. There are many practices that we have tried and tested in the past, not in the context of AI, I would say, but in other change and transformation efforts. I'll use Six Sigma as an example. What a powerful methodology and framework to use in today's context. Because if we really want to get AI adoption beyond that superficial level of I deployed Microsoft Copilot and everybody should learn how to use it, to integrating AI deeply into the fabric of the organization. But if we do not understand the workflow, the processes, how are we going to make the decisions and choices around what should stay with the human, what should be human and AI partnership, or fully being delegated to a machine? So
I
those frequencies
love
wouldn't
that.
go away.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's so funny. I have behind me, well, sort of, kind of, but I revisited my Lean Six, information, my
Mm.
collection because I'm master black belt myself. I
Nice.
mean, prior to recency, but exactly, we look at that, relationship, as you say, value realization, workflows, process efficiencies, even getting into the lean components of waste. But there's also, and this is great because I always get excited when we trigger these things through really good practices that still have relevance, but challenge how we apply them, is
Yeah.
when you look at the people
Mhm.
approaches in six and you look at that invitation for people to be part of the identification of opportunities and improvement. Isn't that really at the heart of what we're also talking about? And fantastic in terms of leveling up, if you will, relative to that which surrounds us. You know,
Yeah.
so so you made that point already. It's any transformation and all transformation, really. And then you kind of raise the stakes based upon, the components that we're implementing or that which we are transforming, relative across any number of change types. But it really is, and I love your reference to six because I don't think many people are talking about that, is
Mhm.
how it kind of brings us back to what is it that we are trying to accomplish anyway? Who knows better than the people who have their hands on the work? So I think of people or humans in the loop with that
Yeah.
as well. And then I look at that invitation, around Kaizen and Kanban and all those really great pieces that play into the rituals and the ceremonies that invite people to what we do. Love
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, absolutely. And these might be things that can be adapted. We don't have to be so true to the practice that it becomes like a shackle for us to move forward. But these are such beautiful tools to be adapted in the context of what we are operating and living with today, and can be leveraged as sense making tools for leaders too, because sense making is such an important piece for leaders to facilitate change broadly in the organization. And I'd love to explore from your perspective, how are leaders in this, like supercharged era of change actually sense making to make those choices and decisions?
It really that is exactly what I was thinking when you were talking about sense making and the ability for us to have all the available tools in our toolkit to meet them where they are. So I would first respond by saying, where are they living?
Mm,
How is their leadership defined? And usually it starts functionally, doesn't it? How are they participating in the organization? And we all know in change and transformation that part of our challenge is not so much, the reporting, it's ensuring that the reporting lands, that the
right.
information that is being conveyed is also being received in the manner in which it's intended and in a manner in which is considered valuable. That is
Mhm,
that's true all of the time. And so I like where you're going in terms of how do we actually, present or build presentation in a way that resonates? And I think it is always in a way that they understand, and frankly, in ways that they are measured. So there
yeah.
are performance components in what you and I are talking about that are critical, I think, in the practice that we do generally, that point towards making sure that what we are communicating or that which we are seeing is not only reflective of the audience that we're communicating that to or with, but that it also serves a purpose in terms of driving a set of decisions and actions forward.
Hmm.
So I think that's key. I think another layer in terms of data is necessarily getting back to the human centricity of what we're doing. I think we do operate as translators, or I think we should operate as translators of that which we are seeing technically and functionally to the level of the individual user, to the end user and their
Yeah.
roles. And also, again, with the expansiveness, with that speed and that, opportunity that we're both identifying here, the ability to enrich roles, the
Yeah.
ability to make, if not recommendations, because sometimes we're more empowered or less to do that. I go for it. I try. But it's to
Mhm.
actually get into those really great conversations, which I think of, as direct solicitation of our HR partners at the table as well, or however they define the people organization in an org. To be able to start embedding those things, and you mentioned that earlier, to really, really embed not just at the level of changes, but in the levels of performance, capability, even values, those kinds of things that, if we were to bleed a certain way in an
Mhm.
organization, is it the same color? Are we promoting that? So I think all of those things are part of sense making relative to understanding the information, feeding those factors or those benefits, those successful outcomes that we're trying to achieve or challenging them. And then also looking at other ways to reinforce the organization through individuals, through people.
Absolutely. So if we look at the decision making at different levels, there's micro decision making and choices that people have to make, which can be happening at grassroots level, where a leader might be able to make sense of the situation because they're so close to where the action is happening and take an action. But also at a macro level, when you are like multiple steps removed from all layers of the organization, if a C suite leader has to make decisions and choices, how do they strengthen their sense making? Because they're not very close to where action is happening. There might be several translation layers in between. Where I'm going with this question, Kimberly, is not every organization has a change capability embedded in their organization.
Pardon me.
One, should organizations invest in a specific change capability? And if they do, where should it sit in the organization? Should it be HR? Should it be IT? Should it be directly reporting to the COO or CEO? Or should it be defined by the context of the organization? What do you say?
Well, that is a mouthful, and so many considerations in that. Beginning with the fact that I'm ragingly, in
Yeah.
favor, biased in favor of formalized change capability in organizations. Pardon me, that can support it.
Yeah.
For a million reasons that go way beyond the idea of tactical change delivery at the level of the projectized initiative, and
Hmm.
all the way through to the kinds of tentacles that you and I are talking about, where we see through, if you will, to transition and sustainment at that level of operations,
Hmm.
real value realization at the level of, I think, what good change looks like. So there's that. But to kind of come back to your to your initial question around, how do we connect, vertically in the organization? I think, again, coming into your earlier suggestion about being earlier involved in the work is about necessarily designing in those connections where we are strategically aligned and connected across our success factors, across the benefits realization. Also, in representation of roles at the table in terms of who is responsible, not
Mm,
just to sponsor, we talk about that all the time, but to steward,
mm,
shepherd, to really be good custodians of the change. And that really does go through the organization so that we
mm,
are empowering those frontline roles that we absolutely love and embrace, because that is where we see and feel the effects of change. But I would argue as well that if we're really well designed, we're actually connecting that level of connection, if you will, that level of investment and skin in the change game, from top to bottom and also horizontally in the organization as well. I think that that kind of design that you and I were talking about is also a tremendous opportunity and is sometimes underestimated and missed when we're not involved early enough and not involved at a level in which we can design that kind of influence in. I think of design thinking if we're, talking about other sort of
yeah.
activities and frameworks and approaches, that is a really good one that we use often. The other piece that you mentioned that I appreciate as well is this idea of how do we change capability? What does it look like? And is it an investment? And I think the way that I look at it, and again, this may come from that outlier perspective, coming in, having impact and effect, and then leaving, is that there is, as I said earlier, deep interest that I have, which is a bit of an anti consultant model, to be quite frank, that we not only leave the place better than it was when we came in, but that we actually are supporting ways and means that organizations can build capability formally, and I would add informally, at the
Mm,
level of work and throughout the operation. So if it is something that actually is formalized in a change capability, I like the ones that I have seen that I really feel perform the best are really focused on the enablement activities. They
mm,
might not even call themselves, change management, or they might call themselves transformation offices as well, right? It really depends upon the organization and the kinds of structures that they're willing to tolerate, operate, and
mhm,
embrace, because that's also a consideration as well. And where they live, I think, becomes a more interesting discussion, because and again, this is really my view based upon multiple deliveries, and you've lived them as well, is that a centralized perspective, I think, around change and transformation capability is more and more warranted in organizations, instead of maybe being a layer of function, a layer of practice, a layer of perspective, in another department. Why? Because I think if it is fully capable and driving full capability, it is necessarily linked to every single function, every
mhm.
single department, every single position, vertically and horizontally in the organization. It is one of the few, I would believe, and we have a number of them, fully holistically driven
Mm,
orgs, if you will, within an org. Where I feel that can also be a benefit is in supporting without siloing, because I think that's the risk we also have when change is living in certain places, is that we lack the ability to be able to have all of those, all of that practice, all of that evolving capability. I'm going to use the word standard approaches carefully, relative to an organization, but that wisdom and knowledge at the very least, and repeated processes, right?
mm,
Mindset, perspectives on change really tentacle out into the organization and be looked after with, also, I would add lastly, a feedback loop that constantly drives what good looks like, back to those orgs or teams or however you want to describe that competence in the environment. But I think it's potentially that significant and that
mhm.
meaningful. Doesn't necessarily have to be big and large and clunky. Well, that's reflective of the organization, isn't it? But at the very least, I think it is driving a very focused, committed, invested approach to not just change delivery, but change operationalization, to
Yeah.
transformations in the hands of owners.
I love that centralized view of change from your perspective, Kimberly, because, like we've talked about multiple times now, that if we look at change with the lens of AI, it is truly like that movie title, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. So there's
Yeah.
no part of the business that cannot be evolved or enhanced with AI. But where do organizations start? You can't transform your entire organization in snap of a finger. You have to make decisions and choices around where to start. And two, once you start, this change is not like rolling out Salesforce.com or an ERP solution. Here, you have to really look at the workflows, look at ways of working. Some roles may exist, some new roles might be created. People will be impacted to a much greater degree across the organization. So, having a centralized body of change, which may be not just pure change practitioners. Maybe it's people from HR, maybe it's people from IT, from operations, so that there's a cross functional mindset share that's happening to design an experience for change for the organization's part that has been impacted.
I love that. And there are things and this is why I enjoy these conversations so much, because they do fire other things in the sense that,
Mhm.
it's mobilization, isn't it? The ability for an organization to mobilize at the right time for the right reasons with the right
Mhm.
people, as you're suggesting, with that cross-functional mix is glorious
Yeah.
to respond again, to whatever a set of change or set of changes might warrant. But there's also that piece that you're mentioning too in terms of integration, right?
Mhm.
And also prioritization. I think that's a piece that we notice, really around an initiative based work
Mhm.
where we don't necessarily always have visibility to the prioritized set of decisions that were made preceding it, but we definitely see it when we're going down the path. We definitely do learn about what's happening elsewhere in the organization. And you're absolutely right. It is more or less understood, formalized, considered.
Mhm.
But I think that is a skill, almost a competence, right?
Mhm.
A requirement increasingly around delivering complex, constant change and transformation is the ability to have a location in the organization, with
Mhm.
those skills that you're talking about, to be able to support those activities as well in favor of what's being asked to do.
Yeah.
So yeah, that comes to mind as well when you talk about really, the fitness and the activities, the muscle, if you will, in those
Mhm.
groups,
Yeah,
ideally.
absolutely. Talking about that, you just sparked a thought in my brain just now, Kimberly. I'm curious to know, again, based on the work that you're doing in this space with a variety of organizations, if we think about change as a standalone capability which has tentacles across the organization and is a cross functional entity in a company, which organizations will be ready to adopt that kind of an experiment that let's build a change capability that facilitates adoption and not just adoption, but adaptation with AI? Because the business model also stands to be disrupted in a big way with AI in the mix. It's not just, at individual level, whole organization, its ways of working and the people in it, everything, all layers will be impacted eventually. Which organization will be most ready or open to experiment with this idea? Small, medium,
Yeah.
large, what's the cultural nuance, context?
Yeah, it's interesting. And the work that we're doing, speaking just very realistically and pragmatically, where we're seeing, uptake are in those organizations that are highly regulated, right? And that have compliance needs because there's a significant level of governance usually existing in those organizations, right? There is a requirement to make sure that decisions are seasoned, if you will, that there tends to be that built-in layer of risk aversion, if I would put it that way. So that brings in an element or a piece of what we believe as a practice really contributes to enablement, inclusive of AI enablement, is this notion of not just good governance, but all the other perspectives that come with it around risk, compliance, right? And those other activities are important as we kind of hold the center of what a technology, a tool in this case, an intelligence or set of intelligences really are designed to do, or what we're intending to do, from a values based output. So I think that's an interesting segment, and they're often in those highly regulated, privatized industries, but also public sector. Of all places where there is that sort of requirement, if you will, to underwrite, right? To be specifically pre-audited, right, and
Mm-hmm.
secure around those decisions. At the other extreme are those organizations that tend to be highly innovative, that are very, very market savvy and market driven, that are built in incredibly competitive places. And so there is a natural appetite, which is ironic because it's the exact opposite in some ways, being
Mm-hmm.
more risk prone, calculated, but again, more calculated because of the benefits of AI, right? And
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned the importance of it, both at the sort of individual capability, which is one thing. And I think we hang out there a lot and it's still underrealized, in my opinion.
Yeah.
That's another conversation for another day,
Yeah.
mayhaps. But also, as you said, threading through the organization, building that enablement for the reasons, why it exists. And in some instance, these organizations, it's all about competitive edge, right? And more nimble, agile decision making, right, at the level of product. Right.
Yeah.
That's a big one, right? Productization is a huge one. There's another activity that I would add as a third,
Mm-hmm.
now that I polarized our conversation a little bit, is this, and I was talking to someone the other day and they had called it M&A mania. And I would tend to agree, right? So the art of acquisition, the idea of, integration, all these other activities that are happening. I think the opportunity there, because of the movement we have in marketplace, organization to organization, right? When we look at that sort of M&A piece, is the wonderful opportunity that we have in AI, especially, around data, around expediency, around, agility, to be able to not only inform deals and drive those kinds of assessments and those pieces that form that activity, but also actually inform the integration in the post-close phases as well. So those are some pockets where I see some interesting, rich behavior, but for reasons that are entirely distinct and
Yeah.
should be. But
Yeah.
I think what it's saying is that there are many applications and many ways to be able to skin that proverbial cat, if I should even say that out loud, but to look at the ways in which we look at the organization, why it exists, and what it is intending to do, in terms of our responses and approaches.
I love that you've kind of given us different flavors of how this implement like the AI, how AI can impact organizations in different ways. And this brings me to the word that I've heard you use multiple times in our conversation today, which is enablement. So can you help our audience understand the difference between thinking with enablement lens versus management lens? Like it's change management, performance management, everything is management, but that might not work. That mindset or solution design might not work. And if that doesn't, enablement would work. But what does enablement look and feel like, and why enablement?
I love it. And, and this is great reflection, back to me as well in terms of our own mindset and our own approach to what change and transformation, represent and what it means. Change management, I feel from a pure, disciplinary perspective is what it is, right? It's,
Okay.
I think of project management, in much of the same ways. And I think that's actually where it stops.
Mhm.
Right. We were talking earlier about the fact that it's not linear. It's not single
Yeah.
event. It's no longer a line item, on a plan. We're way
Mhm.
past that. Now, am I suggesting that that doesn't exist from a tactical delivery standpoint? No. But is that all there is? And what
Yeah.
I'm challenging in the overuse maybe of the word enablement is the idea, and you pointed to it already, is that it is organizational in focus. It's not just looking at the particular initiative based success that we're trying to achieve, though we are often on the hook, right, to make sure that we're delivering that change outcome and that change value. But we're also really, again, coming back to human centricity, to humans in the loop, to decision making and strategy, to all those connectors that are important in organizations, that it is a view on change capability that exceeds the projectized view of the work. It
Yeah.
is actually that enriches me to no end as a practitioner and working with others.
Mhm.
It's this view that we are not only doing the deed, but we are also building capability, making other recommendations around ways of working,
Yeah.
finding new ways to approach data-driven decision making, leveraging intelligence, being able to apply it to positions of performance. Those kinds of things is really, in my mind, what enablement is. And there's one last piece that I think is hugely important when I use the word, and that is that the terminus is not when the delivery is done. It's actually when we have successfully operationalized the outcomes, when people have change in not only their hands at the level of the work they're doing, but they're actually co-owners in where that change travels.
Beautiful.
That is the happiest point, and often, again, coming from a consultant perspective, we don't always get to see it, but increasingly, and that's because of time in, we will hear the stories, we get invitations back, we have opportunities to see some of the realization. You mentioned 6 earlier, to look at that ownership
Yeah.
at the individual and the team level around improvement. Those kinds of things, I think, are part of what I believe change enablement looks like.
Yeah. I love it. And I'm a big fan of the word enablement, to be honest with you. Every time I've been given an opportunity to solve a problem, I have applied the enablement lens, and I can, through my lived experiences, tell you when you apply the enablement lens, how you solve is very different than when you look at managing a project, managing change, managing performance, that lens. Because enablement helps you think much more holistically. So you're designing, and then it also helps you look at all layers of the problem. So you will go to the infrastructure layer to support
Yes.
exactly the outcomes that you're talking about, that we want this to be continuous, and we want it to be sustained, and we want it to happen organically on its own, because the end state of this change is not defined yet. If we manage the change, we are managing it from point A to point B. But what if point B is not the end game here? So how do we enable consistent and scalable change and adoption? So I love that word.
Absolutely. And there's something you point there too, which comes back to capability and
Yeah.
the ability to your excellent point that it's not just B, could be B's, could
Yeah.
be Z's. It could come back again. But the idea too that if we're equipping organizations in the ways that we believe they should be equipped, or that I do believe is a very big part of our practice, then they're in better positions to be able to manage, cope, adjust, adapt, and own continuous change.
Yeah.
Right. So I love that perspective you have about that, holistic. It's that word that tends to be overused and cliched now at that point. But
Mhm.
in these instances, it has incredible meaning for
Yeah.
what we're describing we do.
Absolutely. So, as we wrap up our amazing conversation, which I think we can have for another hour, because I think we've just scratched the surface and just touched on topics. Each of those we can dive deeper into. But for today, we will pause our conversation. And before we do, Kimberly, any piece of recommendation or advice you have for our listeners who are thinking about facilitating change from their vantage point, be it an individual contributor or a people leader in an organization, and they're stuck, what should they be thinking about to facilitate change?
That is such a great question. And there are two things that I would encourage, and that is, to go in eyes open, eyes wide, ears to the ground, to really gain a great understanding as to the organization,
Mhm.
its identity, again, its belief as to why it exists, what it intends to do, understand the culture, as part of the design element. Why? Because I think what I would encourage other practitioners to do is and we said it earlier, to really view where we are as tremendous opportunity to add influence, to create a little bit of legacy if we're so
Mhm.
inclined, to really build great capability that only fuels and it benefits us in the end, fantastic change over and over and over again. That's what we want to be a part of. We've all put out fires. We've all done the interventions. We've
Yeah,
all done those things. But I think this view of continuous improvement, of consistent layers and levels of success, of our roles, absolutely as ambassadors of how we can actually accomplish that in various means or through various means in organization is pivotal right now.
I love it. And if there's one thread that I'm taking away from this conversation with you today, Kimberly, it's that transformation doesn't fail because organizations lack technology. It fails when they lose sight of people, design, and the intent because of which they are embarking on the change journey. So thank you so much for bringing such a grounded and honest perspective to this conversation today, Kimberly. There's a lot here for leaders to sit with. And I'm sure we'll have to continue this conversation and do a part two.
Absolutely look forward to it. Thank you so much for having me. Such a wonderful opportunity to talk about great work that we can do.